Okay, so welcome to the second episode of Podcastic. We shot the first one with Pim Althoff a month ago, I think, and yeah, we got some nice feedback from the people watching the podcast. And yeah, since you were coming to the Tinel event as well, I was hoping to shoot the same feature with you as well. So thanks for accepting it. Just about you, your name is Nara Kasbergen. You come from the U.S., from Washington D.C., but you were born in the Netherlands, and you could basically say that you are Mrs. Worldwide, right? You've been to quite a lot of places. You lived in Munich, Houston, Pittsburgh, Tokyo, New York City, and yeah. Now you work as a senior full stack developer at NPR, National Public Radio. But let's talk about your journey to where you are now. How did it start? How did you get into web development?
Sure. Basically, when I was about 9, 10 years old, I was very into creative writing. And I thought I was going to be a writer for a living, and I used to write short stories. And at one point, my dad said, hey, we should really build you a website on this thing called the internet, so then more people can read your stories. And so he set up the initial website for me. But my dad is very much more the engineering type. He was not a designer. And so I looked at the site and said, I feel like this could be prettier. And so I started teaching myself how to code, just initially basically to try to make that site prettier. And then over time, adding more content myself. After a couple of years of basically just having these static HTML pages, I kept running into this issue where every time I wanted to add a page to the site, I had to update the menu on every single one of these HTML files. And so I was talking to one of my internet friends in a chat room, and he said, hey, you should try out this thing called PHP, because it has this feature called includes that you can then use to just put your menu bar in one file and then import it in all the other ones. And that sounded really cool. So that's when I started teaching myself PHP. I think that was when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And so by the time I was graduating from high school, I was often doing websites for like small jobs and volunteer projects and things like that. To the point where when I was trying to decide what to study in college, I did not want to do web development anymore because I'd been doing it for quite a long time already. Initially thought that I wanted to go into video game programming, and so I enrolled in a program where my major was graphic design, but I was minoring in computer science. I figured that might be a good way to end up in the video game world. But it was while I was in college that I started hearing all these stories about how truly difficult of an industry that is to work in, because they basically tend to work people to death, and I didn't want to do that. And had a little bit of a crisis by the time it was time for me to graduate, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I didn't want to go into video games. I also knew I didn't want to be a web developer. Ended up going to graduate school right after college. And that's when I realized, for me, it doesn't matter so much what I'm doing, whether it's web development or something else, as long as I care about what I'm working for, like what the mission of the work is. Basically, grad school sort of inspired me to have with the idea of working for nonprofits. And so my first job after grad school was working for an organization. It was essentially a research lab that was based out of a university, and they were doing education technology research and basically building web apps for that. And after that, I moved to my job at NPR, which is also a nonprofit.
And you've been there for the past 5 years, right?
Yeah, 5.5, right about now, yeah.
Yeah. So as we mentioned in the intro, now you work as a full stack developer at NPR, a lead developer. So and nowadays you mostly work on custom applications for voice UI platforms. That's quite a world. I mean, just to get into it, and since it is like a cutting edge technology that's just coming in, and now we got those like 4 platforms which are Alexa, we got Google Home, we got Apple HomePod, Samsung Bixby. And I mean, initially Alexa and Google Home were primarily RSS feed parsers and with a text-to-speech engine. But what's the current state? I mean, it's been a while since they launched. So.
Yes. So Alexa and Google both have sort of full-fledged developer platforms now, where you can build your own sort of consumer applications for these platforms. There's still quite a few limitations in terms of what you can do, but it certainly goes a lot beyond just the sort of RSS feed parsers now. So the options are pretty wide open. The HomePod and the Siri kind of platform is still pretty sort of tightly confined. There's not a whole lot that you can do there as a third-party developer, so that's why we at NPR have not really been doing much with Siri quite yet. And then Samsung Bixby, it's interesting that they are they're actively working on their developer platform. They are sort of reaching out to third-party developers as well. It's interesting too that they poached a lot of engineers for Bixby from a lot of the other major companies, so they have like a really impressive team of people working there. But unfortunately, their actual speaker device still hasn't launched. So I think for many companies, it's not really worth investing in Bixby development yet until that speaker is out there. And they keep saying it'll launch before the end of 2019. They were just thinking that they might announce it at the Berlin IFA show, which was happening this week, and it didn't happen. So I guess we'll see if it will actually launch before the end of the year.
Yeah, and when you compare those four, which one would you say is the most impressive when it's in its current state?
Alexa by far is definitely the most far along in terms of like the sort of breadth of features that you can implement with it. Google has quite a few features as well, but I think there tend to be a lot more limitations in terms of what you can do with them. The one area where I would say where Google is kind of leading the pack is in terms of internationalization and support for other languages. And so that's where I think Google definitely has an edge here in Europe, whereas in the US, Alexa is still definitely the market leader.
So have you heard, like, is there like a recent development that they're looking also in the way of adding like multi-language support, or how does it go?
It's something that they're actively working on. I think that's one of the areas where the Alexa team has been staffing up the most. It's interesting too that my fiance's cousin is getting a PhD in linguistics, and she was saying that like everyone in her program, they're getting offers all the time from like Amazon and Google, like. Yeah. They're hiring like linguistics people right and left because they realize now that that's one of the areas that they most need to invest in.
Yeah, there you go. You don't need to be a developer to work at Google or a marketer
Exactly.
or something like that. Yeah, and I mean, you did touch upon Alexa as the most advanced device in its current state, but up until a few months ago, Alexa only had her initial like version 1 skills kit for SDK. And you could work with it, but recently they released a second version. So how big was the leap? Was it the big change?
It was a huge change because basically for version 2, what they did was they threw away everything that they had before and started from scratch, which as developers I think sometimes makes sense. I think we've all had those projects where like we started working on it and we didn't really know what we were doing. And then by the time that we were finished, we were like, I kind of want to start over and actually with all the knowledge that I have now, make it better. And so I think that's essentially what they did. They also rewrote all of it in TypeScript and essentially ended up with something that is largely backwards incompatible with the previous version. I like to compare it to AngularJS versus Angular 2 for the front-end developers who know a little bit about what that means. Also mostly backwards incompatible, we're definitely in a similar state with Angular 2 and AngularJS right now as well, where anyone who is starting out with Alexa development now, I would say definitely start with version 2 of the SDK. There's no good reason why you should be working with version 1 now, but you're probably going to have the challenge that when you're Googling for how to do something, all the resources that you find online are going to be in V1. And that's definitely kind of a tough thing to deal with.
Yeah. And you've been working on Voice UI for how long now?
Right about 2 years. Yeah, it was September 2017 when my team was created.
Yeah, and I mean, recently I've seen you actually blog a lot, so people can actually find a lot of resources coming from you and your team as well. So recently you wrote a blog. You made a feature called Alexa Play the Morning Edition, which is a morning edition of your show on the NPR radio. And it's a new way to listen to Amazon Echo and Alexa-enabled devices. And the morning show is a show that's known to be a mixture of like national programs and local stories. And it's kind of impossible to play the same story for people who live in different parts of the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. For example, Massachusetts or Alaska is not the same program, it's not the same happenings, and not the same interest from those people. So instead of creating 300 individual shows for all those small parts of the country, you came across a small hack. So could you tell us a bit more about it?
Yeah, it wasn't so much a hack as we essentially entered into a contract with a company that was able to basically, for all intents and purposes, create 300 versions of the show for us. They're called Omni Studio. They're actually based out of Melbourne, Australia. So that was an interesting challenge where we had calls with them sometimes, and it would be 5 in the afternoon for us and 7 in the morning for them. But they're a really great team. They're super passionate about audio and podcasts and that sort of thing. And so their main service that they offer is essentially a way to record a live stream. It's generally based off of sort of like a calendar or schedule that you give it. So we would say, for example, here's the URL of this live stream. You start recording at 6 a.m. local time and you finish recording at 7 a.m. local time. And then they essentially take that segment, turn it into an MP3, and that MP3 can then be used almost like a podcast. It's put into an RSS feed. That sort of thing. So they do that for us. Their platform essentially creates those RSS feeds for us automatically. And so then all our Alexa skill essentially has to do is go and check those RSS feeds and essentially grab the latest episode.
Okay, so that's from the platform perspective, but how does it actually work from the customer perspective? I mean, if a person wants to listen to a show that's based in his hometown, how does he activate it, let's say?
Yeah, so the user would say, Alexa, play Morning Edition. And in this case, we assume the user's never used this before. So they're going to be asked if they know the name of their local station. And if not, we're going to ask them for their location. And I can't remember the exact analytics off the top of my head, but let's say maybe 50% of users actually know the name of their station. Some users don't. They actually just think of their local station as NPR. And so in that case, we offer them the opportunity to either give us a zip code or tell us the name of their city and their state. And if they do that, we will give them the 3 closest stations to that location, and then they can choose one. Or sometimes there's only 1 or 2 options, depending on where they're located. Like if you're way out in Alaska, there's not as many options because it's such a huge state. So then they pick that station, and then after that, that's essentially saved as their favorite. And so anytime after that they say, Alexa, play Morning Edition, it'll just automatically play it from that station. You do have the opportunity, if you want to change that station later on, and that, again, gets saved as a preference.
It's cool. And just touching upon the regular state of Voice UI, I mean, it has quite a lot of issues, especially from the outside perspective, from people who haven't really touched the code or even taken a look at it. But I mean, starting with the first one would probably be privacy and handling data. So did you manage to dip into the code and see how does it actually work? Does it like gather the data all the time, as people are probably doubting it to do, or is it like waiting for that trigger for the name to start?
Yeah, as far as I know from the research that I have read, they've done studies where they use tools like Wireshark to inspect the network traffic, and they were able to see that, for example, the Amazon Echo was not sending anything to the Alexa's server until someone actually said Alexa. But obviously, I think you would have to, really truly take the device apart in order to get a little bit more of a sense of the inner workings of it. But yeah, I definitely understand that this is a concern for a lot of people. Unfortunately, for a company like us building consumer applications, there's not a whole lot that we can do about it.
Yeah, you're just using the platform.
Yeah.
And I mean, in your blog, you also mentioned quite a few of your own issues, which are good actually, because you have a deeper understanding of the algorithm and how it works. And you said there are some issues such as perpetuating gender stereotypes through voice. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so the idea here is that if you think about it, almost all of these voice assistants and virtual assistants almost always have female personas and female voices. Even their names a lot of the time are female. So Alexa, Cortana, Siri are all very female, or at least female sounding voices. The companies that create these virtual assistants always justify it by saying, well, the research shows that people prefer female voices. And to some extent, that's true. There have actually been these studies done where They interviewed people and basically asked them, if you're getting information or getting commands from a voice, do you prefer a female voice or a male voice? And in these surveys, people will always say that we prefer female voices. However, there have also been follow-up tests done where they actually test people in certain situations, like, for example, in their car listening to the GPS, and other situations. And they've basically tested whether it seems like people actually respond better to female or male voices. And there's no significant difference between the two there. Mm-hmm. So essentially, we all say that we prefer female voices, but our behavior doesn't necessarily back that up. So at least my opinion is that the research is kind of thin if there's no actual actions, if it's just based off of sort of survey responses. So it's particularly problematic for platforms like Alexa, where they just don't even give you a choice in terms of, do you want to listen to a female voice or a male voice? That is one of the areas where I think Google Assistant is being a little bit more progressive. Google Assistant actually gives you, I think, something like 9 different voice options as a user, and then even as a third-party developer, I think you get 4 voices that you can choose from in your Google Assistant action. So I think that's nice. Again, it's a little bit tricky because as a company building consumer applications, we don't necessarily have a whole lot that we can do about it. We can't influence Alexa's voice, but something that we at least do in sort of our implementation is we try to avoid the robot voice altogether. One of the nice things about working for a radio company is that we have radio hosts who have very nice voices. And so oftentimes that's what we do for almost anything that isn't dynamic, is that we actually will record them and we'll play that recording instead of using the text-to-speech. And people tend to respond to that better, kind of whether it's even male or female. I think they just like human voices better than the robot voices.
Definitely different. So just underlying that issue, so you would actually pinpoint, just give people an option or try to implement like your regular human voice. So those two as solutions. Mm-hmm. I mean, you did touch upon the current state of voice UI. How do you see it developing? Like, where do you see voice UI? Like 5 years could be probably a big leap, but let's say 3 years from now, mm-hmm. maybe.
I would like to say that I think in the next 3 years, probably the biggest advancement that we will see is some kind of implementation of voice for the web. I think that's the one piece of the puzzle that's still kind of missing, because my sort of big thesis is eventually voice will be an input on every single interface. And so we're kind of getting there already. We've got the smart speaker devices. We've got TVs now that you can talk to that have these voice assistants built in. You've got your smartphone, obviously. So I think the web is still kind of the one sort of missing piece of the puzzle. It's interesting. We don't know exactly who is working on it, other than Mozilla has hinted that they are working on a voice assistant, which is, I think, intended to be like a voice-controlled browser. But we haven't heard anything about that project since June of 2018. I would guess that other companies are working on this as well, but we don't know. So I guess it'll be interesting to see in 3 years sort of how far that technology will advance.
Yeah, that's a nice closure for this topic at least. I'm moving on. I mean, parallel to your career as a software engineer, you've been speaking a lot at conferences as well. And one of the topics, except for your regular job with voice UI and everything, you've been speaking a lot about mental health in IT, and you've become a strong advocate of supporting mental health in the tech workplace. And statistically, that makes sense, because 1 of 5 people suffers from depression, anxiety, burnout, and similar issues. And you also said that the IT industry can be quite challenging due to high stress, long hours, deadlines, etc. But most developers actually enjoy some perks that other industries don't, like educational budgets, remote work, lucrative salaries, traveling, in-house educations, and stuff like that. But mental health has become a taboo topic to talk about. And what spiraled you into it? What was the main reason for you to start speaking about mental health issues?
Yeah, so for me, the big reason was that one of my best friends actually took her own life in September of 2016. And she had been working as a senior JavaScript engineer at a startup in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I wouldn't say that her work was the only reason, obviously, why she ended up doing what she did. But it definitely got me thinking about, how could we have improved her environment? How could we have gotten to this point where she felt like she could speak more openly about what she was struggling with? Because it was definitely always obvious that this was a topic that she wasn't comfortable discussing. Like, even with us as her friends, it had taken a very long time for her to sort of mention that there was anything wrong at all. And I think workplaces, there is some pressure there to try to make yourself available to folks like her, because on a daily basis you see her the most. Like, she was one of my closest friends, but she's across the country. So even though I try to keep in touch, we would talk on like Facebook Messenger all the time. I don't see her in person, so I can't tell if it seems like, oh, she's doing okay or she's not. So ideally, your workplace should be a place where you feel comfortable saying to someone like, hey, I'm having a really hard time right now. I might need some help. And I think the startup culture in the San Francisco Bay Area in particular is fairly bad for that. As you said, there are all of these major perks, but I think it's almost always like a double-edged sword. It's like, we give you all of these perks, but then there's all of these expectations, that you'll like stay at work after dinner kind of thing. Like, the argument is often that these companies will provide you with dinner in the evening because they want you to stay there and work a few more hours. And that's really not good for people. So I don't think it's necessarily a healthy environment. I think the other thing is that it can be very competitive as well. Like, you're constantly trying to kind of prove that you're better than your peers. When in fact, I think there should be more of an attitude of like, we're all in this together. We should be trying to sort of lift each other up and help each other out. So that's why I kind of became passionate about this topic. It was kind of strange. I didn't necessarily know too much about the topic of mental health in tech, but before she died. But I happened to be speaking at a conference 2 days after her death. And I was supposed to be giving just a regular talk about Angular, actually. And decided, there's no way that I'm going to get up on that stage and talk about Angular. And so I got in touch with the conference organizers and I asked them like, hey, is it okay if instead I just give like a lightning talk about mental health in tech? Because this thing happened to me. It's like very fresh on my mind and I think it's important. And so thankfully the organizers agreed. And so I very quickly did a lot of research about, I'm trying to figure out what I was actually going to say other than this sucks and we should all do better. And discovered that there was already this organization that had been formed about this topic called Open Sourcing Mental Illness, that as of right now, I think is one of the only organizations that's kind of solely focused on this topic. And most of their members are folks who are themselves living with depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. And so they're often speaking about their own experiences and working in this industry. And so I ended up joining that organization and I use a lot of their research in my talks. And overall, I think I just spend a lot of time listening to them as well and sort of learning about sort of what their perspectives are, what are their challenges, and then thinking about what people like me can do in order to improve the situation.
What was the feedback after your talk? I mean, you researched it for how long? I mean, it was not a long period.
So that very first talk I had like less than 24 hours essentially, but the feedback was really good. Like people in the audience were crying, so that was pretty powerful. And I think that too kind of helped me realize like maybe I should keep doing this. Like maybe it's worth continuing to talk about this. So I think after that, I took a little bit of a break and then started writing a new talk with even more research. And that one took a couple of months to develop. And that's a talk that I'm still giving pretty regularly now. Like I'm giving it in a couple of weeks from now.
Yeah, sadly, the first one wasn't recorded, if I'm not mistaken. There's no VOD of it currently. And I mean, just moving on. If we as like a member of the IT community and a company and an agency and so on, what can a work colleague actually do to help someone who suffers from mental difficulties, whatever it is?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I've learned is that the more it can be sort of top down, the better, just because ultimately the people at the top of an organization tend to have the most ability to sort of change the culture. And as someone at the top, there are sort of like two tracks of things that you can do. One is making sure that the actual like policies and things like that are good. So things like having flexible hours, having lots of sick leave, making sure that everyone knows what all of their options are in terms of things like taking time off, like medical leave for burnout and all of those kinds of options. And also kind of accompanying that, kind of leading by example as well, I think is really important. So I've noticed in the past, some of the managers that I've had in my career often felt like, oh, they should never take vacation because I need to be here, like the team is depending on me. But in some ways that is actually really harmful, because if you as the leader are not taking vacation, then you're kind of sending the signal to people below you like, oh, maybe I shouldn't take vacation either. Similarly, like along with that, like taking sick leave, or at least working from home when you have a bad cold, all of those kinds of actions, as someone at the top, really resonate with people at the bottom as well. So the more you do that yourself, the more you're inspiring the rest of you people on the team to do the same. And all of these things, even though they might seem like individually, it might seem like, oh, working from home when I have a cold is not that important, but it sort of adds up, right? And all of these things contribute to having a good work culture. And then the other side of it is more related to your communication with your team members and things like that. And I think one of the things that's most important there is having a sense of a little bit of vulnerability. And I know that that's kind of awkward and scary, because many of us feel like by the time that we get to that higher position in the organization, we're not supposed to be vulnerable, right? Like we should be like the superhuman who like never makes a mistake. But that's actually the opposite of what you should be doing. You should be trying to show like you have flaws or you have struggles, whether you yourself are dealing with mental illness or any other kind of physical illness, or whether you're supporting a family member who is going through something. The more you can sort of talk openly about that, the more approachable you make yourself to other people. And ultimately, that's really what you're aiming for, is it's getting to the point where people feel like they can trust you and relate to you enough that they might say like, hey, can we talk for 5 minutes in your office? And they confess like, hey, look, I've been, dealing with a really bad bout of depression and I might need help.
Yeah, but that's a great scenario if it happens. But sometimes, with the topic being a taboo as it is, sometimes it is hard to determine all parameters and just see that the person is suffering. Is there any like methods that you can actually use to encourage people to speak up about their difficulties?
To some extent, yes, but it gets a little bit tricky. The one thing that I always caution folks about is that you are never supposed to try to diagnose someone else. Yeah. Like that's going way too far. Like you're not a qualified mental health professional, so that's bad. So you should never be in a position where you're like, hey, like I think you might be suffering from depression. Like I need you to come talk to me, or I need you to go see a therapist. So that's where your attitude should be like, hey, look, my door is always open. You can come talk to me. But you can't really demand that people come talk to you. And again, I think that's where leading by example is probably the sort of best thing that you can do.
And when you mentioned the example, I think your example is interesting as well, since as you said that you started developing where you were 9 years old. At 13, 14, you will be already building HTML websites. Did you encourage, you obviously did experience burnout and similar stuff. How did you tackle that?
I think for me, what's always helped is having a huge variety of interests. So if I felt like I was burned out from coding, I would just go and do something else. Like I would get back into writing or dive into a video game that I was playing and things like that. And that really helps me. And I think that's kind of going along with like the long hours thing. I think that's where we need more people in the IT industry to recognize that expecting your people to work 10, 12-hour days it's not good if it's pushing them to the point where they're burning out. Like you want to encourage your employees to, only work 8 hours and then go home and then invest in hobbies that are very different from coding, ideally, because they're going to be happier and healthier.
Yeah. Yeah, nice wrap up there. So let's touch a bit more. I think you said enough about this topic, and most of the people who are interested to hear more, they can find your talks on YouTube as well, just to check it out. Some advertising there. Just getting into public speaking, how did you get into it, and was it a big leap for you? And yeah, just start from there.
Yes, it was definitely a huge leap. There were a couple of different factors. The first was that a few years ago, actually when I was at my previous job, I went to a conference in San Francisco. It was a big front-end conference. And one of the things that was interesting there was that they had done a good job of making sure that there were lots of women speakers. Mm-hmm. And so I was watching them, and I think because they looked like me and they sounded like me, there was just like a little voice at the back of my brain saying like, hey, maybe I could do this too. And it would be nice because after that, I went to many different conferences that had mostly men up on stage, and I recognized like probably the best way to change this is just to start doing it myself. Yeah. Honestly, like to a certain point, like you can't keep complaining and being like, hey, there's not enough women speakers. Sometimes the best way to change something is just to do it yourself. And then the other kind of flip side of it is that like I said, I currently work at a nonprofit, and we're considered public media for the United States. And so I felt very much like part of our mission as public media should be to share everything that we know with the public. We do that already with sort of like our reporting and that kind of thing, but I think it works for technology as well. Like we have, I think, an obligation to share what we know about things like voice and web development and mobile development and all of that with the rest of the tech community. And so I went to my boss and I said, hey, look, I think we should start doing this. And he said, yeah, I agree. Sounds good. And then nothing happened. And so that was another one of those moments when I realized, okay, I think I just need to start doing it. Mostly, I think initially it was really just to prove to the rest of my team, like, hey, if I can do this, we can all do this. But for a long time,
as you said, yeah.
Yeah, for a long time it was just me. But thankfully now we've grown to the point where I still do a lot of speaking myself, but a lot of what I do now is also mentoring other people who are interested in speaking and getting them speaking. And then we've been pretty successful. We've had a couple people who, one person just started speaking last year and did 9 talks in her first year. Another one of my coworkers is giving 2 more talks before the end of this year. It's his first year, so
yeah,
it's nice to see
that's huge. Yeah, and a good topic also to dive into, just mentoring future speakers, and that would be kind of useful for us as well, just to try to encourage people to talk more, because all of them are experts at their own field, but they just like looking at the code that they do, they see just as something ordinary or regular. At least it isn't, as you can see. So, what are some of the like methods that you use to encourage people to speak?
Yeah, it's definitely, we've noticed the same struggle. I think when you're so close to the work, you tend to sort of not notice how cool it is. And so there's a couple of different approaches. One is that I've developed a workshop that I usually do a couple of times a year. And it's basically an exercise that gets people very quickly writing down sort of what they've worked on recently, what they liked about it, and those things like that. It's basically 1 hour of you're just basically writing a lot of things down, and then afterwards you look at everything that you've written down, you start noticing patterns like, hey, I kept mentioning this project over and over. Maybe that project is something that I'm particularly proud of. Yeah. And then we also just do a lot of sort of group discussions, group workshopping, encouraging each other. I think it's really important sometimes, especially with sort of the issue that you mentioned, is I might know what you worked on, you think it's not cool, but I'm like, hey, this is really cool, especially like this part about it and this part about it, this part about it. And so that's where I think all of us as peers doing this together works, because we know what we each other have worked on, and so we're able to say like, hey, I really think that this might be a good sort of topic for a talk for you.
Yeah. And just aside from public speaking, you also blog a lot, which is interesting. And also your company page also wrote a blog that I mean, I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but after you joined, they also launched their own blog page, which your peers also write at. And I mean, was that your initiative? Did you see that as a mandatory thing, or how did it go?
Yeah, kind of. It's very closely related to, again, that idea that I had of like, as public media, we should be sharing what we know with the public. And I think it's something that I had been asking about for maybe the first year and a half or so that I joined, kind of trying to figure out like, why aren't we doing this already? And we have this thing that we do 2 or 3 times a year called Serendipity Days, which is inspired by Google's idea of 20% time, although it's much shorter than that, not 20% of our time, but essentially a couple of times a year, we get 2.5 days where we essentially stop work on all of our projects and just dive into something that we're interested in and passionate about. And so at one point I decided I'm just going to do it. I'm going to set up a developer blog for us. And one of my coworkers actually worked on it with me because he was interested in this as well. One of the most interesting things was that setting up the blog itself wasn't that big of a deal. We decided to host it on Medium. And so one of the only decisions that we had to make was like, what is the domain name going to be called? So that was relatively trivial. I think the harder part was we just ended up having to have a lot of conversations with management, trying to find out like, when we want to post something, who do we have to get permission from? Like, how high up the chain does it have to go? Do we have to talk to like the PR people in the marketing department? Or can we avoid all of that? And ultimately, the advice that we got was ask for forgiveness, not for permission. Yeah. And so that's essentially the philosophy that we operate the blog under. We don't have to ask for permission when we want to post something. We just kind of post it, and then if it turns out there's an issue, you know, we ask for forgiveness. We'll edit the post if needed. That actually hasn't come up so far in the past. But I think that works better because I think if it were the kind of thing where people have to get like 3 different layers of approval for everything that they have to post, they would never post.
Yeah. And you said that you didn't have to ask for forgiveness, but how, I mean, is there a positive feedback that comes from the community? And I mean, how often, I guess?
Yeah, overall, I think the feedback is pretty positive. Frankly, I think one of the challenges is that the blog hasn't been that active overall. I think the post that I posted the other day was
the last one before me.
Yeah, there have not been very many. And so I think if we were posting more frequently, then I think people would have sort of more of a sustained interest in it as well. Right now, anytime that we post, it almost tends to kind of catch people by surprise. So the post that I posted the other day, we did get a lot of positive feedback. I think one of the things that was that I really kind of valued was that someone actually said, "Thank you for the transparency." And that to me was like the perfect compliment to get, because that's the whole reason why we're doing this. Yeah. But every now and then we do post things where we don't get a ton of reactions. And again, I think the main thing there is it's not that people are not interested, but if you have a blog that's not that active, it can be a little bit hard to get regular readers and that sort of thing.
And also, while I was doing the research, I noticed that you had a personal website. And yeah, I mean, I just opened like 20 tabs and I left that for the last one. And I was thinking that it is going to be a gold mine for the last one, just to see where you will be speaking and stuff like that. But yeah, I opened the site and it says BRB under heavy reconstruction. So are there any plans to put it in motion?
Yes, this is actually I did have a site before and essentially only had my projects from grad school and college. So a couple years ago, I said, it's been like 5 years since I graduated from grad school. I should probably update this with like the things I've been doing more recently. So I started on a sort of complete redesign, but of course, as an engineer, I like completely overcomplicated it for myself. I decided I want a content management system to manage everything, but I wasn't happy with all the content management systems out there. So then I started essentially modding Silverstripe, which is this PHP-based content management system that I really like working with. And then I had all these grandiose plans about like, oh, I'm going to make this like a generic like a content management system for portfolio sites, and I'm going to open source it, and like other people will be able to install it as well. And so by making it that much more complicated for myself, it was one of those things where instead of just taking a weekend to like redesign my site, it's turned into like a multi-month project. Unfortunately, it's all on hold right now because I'm getting married next spring, and so I need to work. Thank you. I need to work on my wedding website instead. And so at least I've learned the lesson that for that one I should not overcomplicate it. I'm probably just going to make it a static website. But I still need to work on that, so I think it'll probably end up being like winter by the time I can finally get back to my personal site.
Yeah. Let's go over some quick topics, like quick questions. You don't need to go all the way deep, but just to start things off, how do you consume content? What are your main resources for you to like improve as a developer?
I am definitely I'm a mix of just sort of reading things online, mixtures of like blog posts, Stack Overflow answers, that type of thing. And I'm also definitely very hands-on. So if I'm trying to learn a new technology, I'm always going to look for like a GitHub repo that I can check out and just sort of start banging on. That's something that for example, I struggle with if I go to conferences. I have a hard time just like sitting through an entire technical talk. I really need to be sort of hands-on in order to learn something.
Do you have like any specific, I mean, you mentioned Stack Overflow questions, asking questions and stuff, but do you have any specific like shows that you like to watch, like, I don't know, podcasts or similar that you would like to recommend to the viewers? Maybe could be useful for them. Or books, maybe.
Books, maybe. Not a whole lot are coming to mind, especially for technical stuff. Honestly, I feel like a lot of my learning too, I just do by like sort of diving into Wikipedia. I'm definitely one of those people who gets trapped in Wikipedia for hours. And then in terms of podcasts, I don't really listen to any programming podcasts. I guess the only sort of pseudo-technical one that I do like every now and then is Reply All. And then in terms of other things that interest me, I really love, I'm biased, of course, because I work for NPR, but Hidden Brain is my favorite NPR podcast that we produce, which deals a lot with like psychology and how people learn and things like that. I love that kind of thing.
You didn't mention that when it comes to NPR, you do a lot of your own content and stuff like that, and you work in a nonprofit organization. What's the drive that keeps you in a nonprofit, like instead of going to those like major players, larger salaries and stuff? I'm not saying that your salary is probably low, but just an overall perspective.
Right. Yeah. It's really nice to be at a place that has a mission that I believe in. Essentially, NPR's mission statement is we're out there to create a more informed public. And that's something that everyone who works there deeply believes in. I think it creates a different environment too when everyone else is there for the same reason. I think almost all of our other developers had to make the same choice of, hey, I could work for Amazon and be making like 1.5 times what I'm making now, or I could work here on the mission, and all of us are there. And I think it shows too that we have incredible retention. Like I've been there for 5.5 years, but I'm still one of, I wouldn't say I'm one of the more junior members there, but I'm probably maybe like halfway in terms of how long people have been there. The person who sits next to me has actually been there for, I think, almost 16 years now. And that's really hard to say as a tech company, right? Yeah. Like the other companies on average, I think people tend to stick around for like 2 years and then they're always looking for something new. So for us, I think the fact that people have chosen to be here and they're invested in it long term really creates a nice environment that I really enjoy working in.
Another one of these quick questions would be open sourcing stuff. I mean, you are obviously a huge advocate, and you do like to open source the stuff that you do. And what is your main reason to support it?
Again, I think it's all about sort of sharing knowledge, bringing everyone forward. The whole idea is you've probably solved a problem before that someone else is having, so why not help them? And I think a lot of it is about sort of giving back too, because chances are you as a company are already using a lot of open source software. that other people have created. So I think there's a little bit of a responsibility there to try to give something back. And I wish more people would adopt that line of thinking.
Just wrapping up, where can people follow you? Like, where do you share most of your thoughts, and maybe some conferences that you will be attending next?
Definitely Twitter is by far the best place to follow me. I would say it's the only place where I'm really active. So my Twitter handle is XIEHAN.
Is that a gaming handle? Gaming nickname?
I use it for gaming as well, but it's actually sort of my unofficial name in Chinese.
Oh, okay. That's cool.
Yeah.
And what about conferences?
And then conferences, Twitter is probably the best place where I post where I'm going to be next. I now always have as my pinned post sort of where I'm going to be in the next couple of months. And then eventually, probably in winter when I update my website, you should be able to find it on there as well.
Yeah, we'll be following the turn of events. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us, to guest at the second episode of Podcastic. And yeah, that's about it. We'll see you next month.
Awesome. Thank you.